So thank you to Giles, Dick and David and to Jean for a really fascinating start to today. And I think what came through in our first session was a real sort of sense of Tony Crosland coming to life. And it's now my ambition to drink 14 gin, was it 14 or 40 gin and tonics before you go out and make a public speech. The focus of this second session is on Crosland's intellectual legacy. It's a legacy that, as we know, has endured for 60 years. Our final session is going to consider how some of that legacy might be able to be applied to the current situation for social democracy. But first, we've got three speakers here who are going to unpack that intellectual legacy for us a bit more. So Patrick Diamond, as you know, is the brains behind today. He's co-chair of Policy Network, he's lecturer in public policy at Queen Mary University of London, and he's also author of The Crosland Legacy, which has already been much praised. Simon Griffiths is senior lecturer in politics at Goldsmiths, University of London, and his research is mainly focused on recent history of British political thought. And Sunder Katwala is director of British Future, which is a think tank focusing on identity and integration, and he was previously general secretary of the Fabian Society. So we've asked them each to consider Crosland's intellectual legacy from a different perspective. We'll hear from each of them for around 10 minutes and then open things up to questions. So Simon, if I can ask you to go first.
Certainly, thank you very much for having me here. I'm afraid I've written my comments down, so they may be slightly more coherent but less lively because of that. I was asked today to talk about Crosland's views on liberty in particular, but I want to argue that Crosland's views on freedom, equality and political economy are so intertwined, it doesn't make sense to talk about each one on its own. Crosland, of course, as we've heard, is still influencing and shaping the development of the centre-left, as Patrick's new book very ably and excellently demonstrates. But Crosland's influence is also protean, used by people across the centre-left in very, very different ways to inspire divergent views over the state, over pluralism, over equality and personal freedom. And I think in this room, to some degree at least, most of us will all say we are Croslandites now, or at least owe him some intellectual debt. But today I want to argue that what his views on equality and liberty should and do make an enormous contribution to the contemporary left. There was, to be slightly more provocative, a lacuna in his work over his account of political economy that still needs to be filled. So the first area I want to talk about a little bit is equality. And I want to argue this is intimately linked to his ideas about freedom. At the heart of Crosland socialism, as we have heard, is a belief in equality. But with any view of equality, the question is, in Amartya Sen's famous phrase, equality of what? What is the top half of that fraction? What is the numerator? And it's here that I think Crosland makes a significant contribution. Crosland rejects the narrow economistic approach to equality. For a variety of reasons, he argues that equality of outcome is not enough and is too narrow. Crosland's equality is based upon the idea of classlessness and the idea of a classless society. In 1952, 4 years before The Future of Socialism, he wrote, "The purpose of socialism is quite simply to eradicate this sense of class and to create in its place a sense of common interest and equal status." 4 years later, when qualifying those views, he would add that it is significant that these aspirations are not now primarily economic in character. And that's an interesting, fascinating contribution for the left to make. Crosland's view of equality is more redolent of Tawney's argument for fellowship, for example, that we need to defeat the sense of class boundedness that keeps us in place in society. It draws more on Max Weber's idea that status is important than it does on Marx's belief that the economy and economism is the way forward. And it sets socialism, as we heard in the previous panel, on an ethical, on a moral basis rather than an economistic one. That's got profound implications when it comes to policy. In education that we've just been talking about, it creates the possibility of equalisation of class, status and opportunity that is as important as economic redistribution in creating a more equal society. And it explains Crosland's war on those institutions that promote inequality, division and hierarchy, such as grammar schools, which he famously, colourfully pledged to destroy. That argument needs to be made more strongly today than ever before. It also explains Crosland's scepticism about private schools that do not demonstrate their contribution to wider society. He argued you can't stop people setting up private schools without hindering their liberty, but he was deeply sceptical about private schools that did not contribute to the wider good of society. Although perhaps you could say he didn't recognise the importance of positional goods in securing status. Schools that offer status by virtue of their pupils or other pupils not being able to go there would be anathema to anything that Crosland believed. And if anything, it sets the bar even higher for private schools to demonstrate and be forced to demonstrate their worth to society as a whole and their wider contribution. So Crosland's broadening of equality, democratic equality, as he called it, to include not just wealth, but class and status, remains a significant contribution. And it's linked intimately, as I'll now argue, to questions about liberty. So the second area I want to talk about is what I'll concentrate on today, Crosland's view on liberty or freedom. And I argue that's perhaps Crosland's greatest contribution in that he injected a libertarian verve into socialist thought, marking a departure from the kind of drab economism of earlier socialists. This is most famously set out in a passage in The Future of Socialism where he advocates liberty and gaiety in private life in language that evokes the kind of drab greyness of post-war London and which is now in need of updating. He calls for, and I'll read the passage, more open-air cafes, brighter and gayer streets at night, later closing hours for public houses, more local rep theatres, better and more hospitable hoteliers and restaurants, brighter and cleaner eating houses, more riverside cafes, more pleasure gardens on the Battersea model, more murals and pictures in public places, better designs for furniture and pottery and women's clothes, statues in the centre of new housing estates, better designed street lamps and telephone kiosks and so on. This was a rejection of the greyness of post-war Britain. And at the same time, he famously rejected the Fabian socialist tradition. Again, I quote, "Now the time has come for a reaction, for a greater emphasis on private life, on freedom and dissent, on culture, beauty, leisure, and even frivolity." And as he famously says, "Total abstinence and a good filing system are not now the right signposts to a socialist utopia. Or at least if they are, and this is something of a nod to his own private life, some of us will fall by the wayside." So this commitment to freedom at a time of reaction is still relevant, crucially relevant to today's society. The United States has elected a Congress, large parts of which are in favour of curtailing the reproductive choices of women, the rights of gay and transgender citizens and ethnic minorities, and a president who appears to view freedom as a licence for the powerful. In Britain, there are contemporary lessons to be drawn. I would argue that Crosland would caution against the social conservatism of the left. The argument that we sometimes hear that Labour's traditional vote is ambivalent about diversity, so that a Labour Party that promotes personal freedom will not win elections. I do not think that would get very far with Crosland. The ideas of Blue Labour, for example, which at their least sophisticated, stereotype the views of the working class as intolerant of difference, and argue as a result Labour should be too, do not, at least to me, seem to fit very well with the arguments of a future of socialism. In contemporary political theory, I argue that the best developments of Crosland thought come from Raymond Plant, Lord Plant, who uses Crosland to provide a kind of bulwark against the arguments of the new right. So Plant's response to that famous question, equality of what, from the mid-1980s onwards, was that equality should be about liberty. Plant takes Crosland's view and he pushes it further. And for Plant and Crosland too, implicitly, what mattered was that freedom is of roughly equal value to everybody, and creating a society where this is the case should be the primary role for the left today. So Crosland provides the basis for politics where freedom is of roughly equal value for everyone, linking freedom and equality inextricably in the good society. I want to finish with a kind of question about Crosland. The engine Crosland needed for the good society is less convincing. We've heard he was a fine economist, a competent economist. He was a Keynesian thinker, but he was less original there than in his other contributions, I would argue. For Crosland, a growing economy was needed in order to secure his vision of a good society. Only as the economy grew could democratic equality be possible, because it could be achieved relatively painlessly, with redistribution occurring while no one loses out in real terms. Crosland never provided a convincing, lasting account of what that what that engine for growth could be. And you hear this critique quite a lot on the left. People like Anthony Arblaster made it, but it doesn't have to be left-wing or Marxist in its origin. So in the 1950s, Crosland had the answer to this, as many politicians did. The engine for post-war growth was Keynesianism, and particularly in his early work, Crosland was very sanguine about this. Writing in the 1950s, Keynesianism plus the reforms that the post-war Labour government had introduced marks an end to capitalism and the emergence of what he called statism, short of socialism, but a good start nonetheless. So Keynesianism could provide the engine for growth that allowed democratic equality. But the post-war consensus and the reliance on Keynesian growth spluttered to a halt in the 1970s, and Crosland was open about this, admitting that, writing in 1975 in Socialism Now, that British society, slow-moving, rigid, class-ridden, has proved much harder to change than we supposed. Looking back with hindsight, the early revisionist writings were too complacent in tone. They proposed the right reforms, but underrated the difficulty of achieving them. Arguably, Crosland and Croslandism was reborn under New Labour, although around a very different consensus. It's notable that Gordon Brown, for example, wrote the preface to the 50th anniversary of The Future of Socialism. Brown argued that had Crosland been alive today, he would support everything that Brown did, although he also wrote something very similar in his preface to a new version of Adam Smith's work as well. New Labour was reliant on market-based growth to provide the engine that would lead to social democratic reform. And from 1992 to the economic crash, this model worked extremely well, allowing substantial redistribution, largely through investment in public services and directed welfare payments. Brown, in particular, was operating in a kind of post-Keynesian, market-based Croslandism. So Crosland's contribution was broad and challenging. It contributed areas that I haven't even touched on here. Yet the end of significant growth combined with long-term stagnation in living standards raises new questions for Croslandites today. How do you convince the electorate of the need for greater democratic equality when the engine of the economic growth that makes those changes possible has stalled, and any move towards a more equal society plays on the insecurities and fear of loss that many people fear? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Sunder.
Thanks very much for the invitation to be here. 10 years ago, for the 50th anniversary of the Future of Socialism, I was General Secretary of the Fabian Society, and so along with Patrick and others, we organised a day-long conference in Grimsby Town Hall and republished, brought back into print, in fact, the Future of Socialism with the new foreword from Gordon Brown, both to debate the legacy and the personal legacy, and Giles Radici, David Lipsey and Dick Leonard were all there with Susan Crosland telling the stories about the man and, bringing that contemporary history to life, but also because the argument was, Ed Miliband, I remember keynoting that in his first year as an MP, Patrick, a young Stella Creasy who hadn't gone into Parliament, that there was a future here for the left in this book, in this argument that could now be played out as New Labour was revising in power. I mean, 1956 was already a long time ago, I think, half a century on, in 2006. Equality, you've got to remember, in the future of socialism is the revisionist heresy of the sellout labour right, which by sort of 2006, that was that wasn't quite where it seemed to be positionally. Now, 10 years on, social democracy's sense of a future is much more battered, much more torn, much more in trouble. And I'm just not sure now, my revisionist heresy for today, I've had the case for, I'm not sure there's very much now in this post-war social democracy that actually answers the questions that we've got today. I think, 4 decades on from his death, if you got Tony Crosland back among us, I think there's one place you could take him in our politics that he'd find very, very recognisable indeed. And that would be the Labour Party, having a very 1977 kind of moment in its internal politics. And that's because the leader of today's Labour Party, Jeremy Corbyn, is probably the least revisionist politician in the history of all of Labour politics. Here is a man who comes into Parliament in 1983 knowing very clearly what he thinks. And as far as I can tell, he has changed his mind about nothing whatsoever in the 3 and a bit decades since. I'd love someone to ask him, Mr. Corbyn, what is the thing on which you've changed your mind? Because things have happened. Thatcherism, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and so on. But he's pretty much sticking with what he thought. So I think Tony Crosland would recognise Mr. Corbyn. But I think Mr. Corbyn looks rather arid in a way, just because he's having the debates of 1977 and 1983, and he's not really, I think, attached to the debates of 2016. So this point is not about the fact that Tony Crosland died in 1977 and therefore could not have anticipated the things that happened. I think Croslandism as a social democratic project was very much around, unacknowledged, under-acknowledged in the form of revisionism that New Labour took as it replaced Clause 4, wasn't so sure about equality. I think Gordon Brown and Ed Miliband are recognisably heirs to that redistributionist tradition of the Labour right wing. But I just wonder whether 2010 and 2015 reveal some gaping contemporary challenges for that politics, and whether Croslandised social democracy has answers. So on political economy, as we said, Crosland knows what to do with the proceeds of growth. He'll spend them on the public services and, the sort of sure start kind of issues feels there. But Brown's Faustian Pact rather comes to an end. The proceeds of the city used to spend on the public services, and the question of where the growth is coming from is now there. Social mobility, I think, is a really big question today. I mean, Crosland is bringing in comps and abolishing grammar schools in an era of massive upward mobility, and the sort of sense of class and classlessness. I think we're culturally much less class-ridden than we were, and yet socioeconomically pretty similarly. I think internationalism and multilateralism of social democracy has just had a massive foundational challenge to it with the loss of Britain's membership of the European Union. And that is about a set of questions of identity and culture as cleavages in politics that were coming into the picture, but I don't think we find very much here. And finally, I think in terms of democracy and politics, a much less deferential age. I just think there are profound challenges. So I think there are all of these challenges to which we don't find very much in Crosland. On Europe, it's quite an interesting point because this is the great cause of the Croslandites and the Social Democrats. It's just that they haven't got Tony Crosland on their side. He says, I've talked to people in Grimsby and they don't really care. Actually, it turns out people in Grimsby care quite a lot about it, and North East Lincolnshire was 70% leave. So his sort of heresy against the Croslandites looks more prescient now. But I think his social democratic tradition has lost another one. Lost one on political economy in 2008, it's lost another of its foundational pillars, and then it's lost its sort of moderate electable Labour Party in which the left are on the fringes and the right, so I think it's lost that as well. So I think the foundational pillars have gone. Now, the questions of patriotism and identity seem to me the really important ones. I think Crosland was of a generation before 1968 for whom people on the left, patriotism just wasn't a problem. They were patriotic, and it wasn't part of their politics because it didn't come up as an issue. I think that changes after 1968. I think you've got a generation that served in the war and just were patriotic. But there's a debate. He, in 1956, is launching this liberal attack on grey, statist Fabianism. That's absolutely right. And he wins. And we become much more liberal. We become much more educated. We make enormous amounts of progress. But there's a debate starting with Roy Jenkins' speech on multiculturalism and Enoch's speech on immigration and whether we can ever do anything about it in 1968, to which I don't think he ever pays very much attention. And it's not really clear about how this tradition is going to defend liberalism as a growing majority sense, because it feels in retreat now. There is one way, I think, in which Crosland, I think, would have been empathetic to where Labour needed to deal with this question now in identity, politics and immigration, because I think to that sense that he learnt from Grimsby and was engaged in Grimsby, I think that would have helped him, I think, not be too swept away. I think he might have seen the case for being quite torn about the fact that the Labour Party does have its people who buy the Crosslandite vision of social liberalism and an advance, but also seeks to represent people for whom change is difficult. So I think the worst ways to make this case now, I think, in my view, is the sort of open versus closed. It's open versus closed. That seems to me, that's the worst way to defend the values of open in this particular age of populism, because that polarizes the graduate, culturally, economically confident minority against the minority that want to turn the clock back. The question now in places like Grimsby and across the country is how you spread out by class, spread out by place, the sense of who benefits from open. I think the Labour Party feels like it wants to have an internal culture war of a question on which any governing social democratic project anywhere in Europe would have to recognise both sides of the story and find the common ground. The Labour Party tries to do this because electorally, tactically, it's got to say something about this stuff because somebody should. And it doesn't recognise, in fact, that if you invented the Labour Party in the early 21st century, having something to say to the upwardly, culturally confident, multi-ethnic group and having something to say to the people who are left behind, a politics, the common good that can do that is worth having. A social democracy that can't do that is no use to us at all. Thank you.
Sunder, thank you very much. And Patrick.
Well, thank you very much. And I should say, maybe at the beginning, that there's a lot in what Sunder says that I would actually agree with. I mean, I think that if one observes the scale of economic and social changes which have occurred since Crosland wrote The Future of Socialism, and indeed even since he died in 1977, it's pretty clear there have been massive changes in the class structure, the introduction of enormous ethnic and cultural diversity into Britain, the threat of the breakup of the United Kingdom, major questions about the viability of liberalism, which is posing further questions about identity and identity politics. I mean, I think these are all reasons really why we need to interrogate very carefully what is useful about Crosland, but what maybe needs to be either discarded or at least significantly rethought. What I want to address in my remarks very briefly is just a theme which is really about Crosland's ideas on equality. And I don't want to reprise any great length the ideas that Crosland set out in his books, but I want to try to begin to apply a notion of equality to the kind of challenges which we are facing in the world today. If we want to try to develop a plausible egalitarian vision for the 21st century, what is it that we can learn and take from Crosland that might be useful in doing that? Now, I think it's very striking that in the period between Crosland's death in 1977 and today, the relevance and salience of equality in our politics appears to have come full circle. In the 1980s and 1990s, in the period after Crosland died, the ascendancy of market liberalism, the triumph of Thatcher and Reagan, drove inequality to a large extent to the margins of the political agenda. And it was extremely difficult in this period to enunciate any kind of coherent egalitarian agenda, which would have been dismissed politically in a context where, of course, Labour had lost in Britain 4 consecutive general elections. But since the financial crash, in particular in 2008, 2009, there are signs of something of a sea change, at least in terms of the political discourse and the debate. The issue of economic inequality has slowly risen up the political agenda of most of the advanced capitalist countries, particularly in Britain and the United States, albeit with very unintended consequences, not least in the recent presidential election. And the work of economists like Thomas Piketty, Tony Atkinson, and many others has really had an enormous impact in better understanding the scale of rising inequality since the 1970s. Indeed, beyond that, I would say that there are some New Labour politicians who have been forced to, who in the 1990s eschewed any mention of the word equality, who've been forced to rethink and revise their position to some extent. So really the question I'd like to pose in my contribution this afternoon is, does this new context of a backlash against liberal globalization, free trade, greater concern and hostility to an ever wider gap between rich and poor, does this offer an advantageous or propitious climate for a revival of Croslandite egalitarianism? Well, let me be clear on this point that I do not believe that there is an egalitarian strategy from Crosland that we could read off from The Future of Socialism or any of his other texts. What's important, it seems to me, is to reflect on the disposition, as Giles Radici terms it, the cast of mind that Crosland would have brought to these questions. And I think there are some elements in Crosland's disposition which are still useful to us today. The first and most obvious is really the combination of intellectual rigor, but also practical focus which Crosland brought to these debates, and a sense that we needed as social democrats to address the world as it actually is, rather than the world as we would like it to be. He was also rigorously iconoclastic and demonstrated a determination to challenge conventional wisdom. Crosland, of course, as we've heard already, displayed an insistent revisionism. He wanted to apply socialist values to new problems, and he wanted to develop new means of tackling some of the most pervasive forms of disadvantage in our society. And I would also say, and again, this is something perhaps missing from many social democratic parties today, not just, of course, in Britain, but also across Europe, which is that Crosland had a very clear view about the kind of society that he was trying to bring about. It was a society characterized not just by a fairer distribution of income or wealth, but also a society with markedly less classlessness, a society less affected by inherited privilege and wealth, a much greater sense of social leveling between different social groups, much greater interaction across the class divide. So if we are to, in a sense, commit to the kind of revisionist social democratic position that Crosland was setting out, and if we really wanted to try to tackle today the insidious rise of inequality which has developed over the last 3 decades, building on Crosland's legacy, in my view, there are 3 central issues with which we should be concerned. The first is about the politics of fiscal policy and tax and spend. The second is about the relationship between intersectional inequalities, particularly inequalities relating to gender, ethnicity, and disability. And then the third is the relationship between equality and meritocracy. And I'll just say a few words about each of those before I finish. In relation to fiscal policy, New Labour's approach after 1997 was essentially based on the view that British voters wanted United States levels of taxation combined with Nordic quality public services. And perhaps for a remarkably long period between the late 1990s and the late 2000s, it appeared as if in office Labour might be able to deliver on this very difficult balancing act. But of course, in 2008, the financial crash largely eradicated economic growth and severely weakened the UK public finances, and this left unanswered, really, a set of really critical challenges. I think one of those challenges is to do with the long-term underfunding of the public services. And that if public services are to deliver the quality of service that people expect, if they're to tackle pervasive inequalities, and if they're also to ensure that Britain can compete effectively in the rest of the world, then they clearly have to be adequately funded. And it's still the case today that Britain spends less on health and education than other major European countries. And of course, alongside this, there are other significant cost pressures to do with demography and the impact of technology and so on. And New Labour really had no answer to this question of how to address the long-term underfunding challenge. I think another challenge in relation to fiscal policy and tax and spend is that the weight of thought within social democracy for much of the last 4 or 5 decades, including in the New Labour period, has been towards the emphasis on the taxation of income. And this has remained the focus of fiscal policy. But really, it's the enormous wealth divide in countries like Britain that should most concern us. The ownership of assets and property remains heavily skewed towards the wealthiest in society. In the UK, the richest 1% of households own 20% of all marketable wealth, and the top 10% of households own 850 times more wealth than the bottom 10%. So that in the future, there would have to be, in any social democratic prospectus, much greater attention paid to the taxation of capital, property, wealth, and inheritance. And I think inheritance in particular, while a very difficult political question to address, will be something that social democrats have to look at in the future, the case for much more effective taxation of inheritances, to do something about the insidious transmission of wealth between generations and the massive wealth divide which is emerging, as I've already said. The second point is about the intersectional nature of inequality and its interaction with economic inequalities. I think in Crosland's work we get a very strong account of economic inequality and its dimensions, relating to the dynamics of markets, factors of production, and economic factors. But for any egalitarian today who's serious about producing a more equal and fair society, there would have to be attention to the interaction between economic inequality and these kinds of pervasive intersectional inequalities, as I've said, relating especially to gender, disability, and ethnicity. And if Crosland had have been alive today in 2016, then we would like to think perhaps that he would have considered the case for a serious assault on inequality, combined with concerted action to address the persistence of the gender pay gap, which still remains almost as wide as it was 30 years ago, concerted action to deal with ethnic discrimination in employment, and the pay penalty, which is disproportionately suffered by particular BME groups. And I think also we would hope that Crosland would have taken seriously the pervasive effects of disability on people's life chances, particularly the very neglected field of mental health and mental illness. And I would also say, in respect of the point about intersectional inequality, that Crosland, we would hope, would also have addressed the massive challenge which we face in the labour market today. And I'm not going to say much more about this, but it seems clear to me that the balance between security and deregulation in the labour market would have to be substantially rethought from how those policies were developed in the new labour era. The impact of labour market flexibility has been perhaps much greater than we initially understood, and today's report, which highlights the fact that there are 7 million people in Britain who are in work but living in poverty, in my view underlines the dysfunctional nature of the labour market, which has been going on for too long. The final point, which I'll try to finish on briefly, is about the relationship between equality and meritocracy. Of course, Crosland's close friend, Michael Young, addressed this question in his famous work in which he satirized the emergence of a meritocratic society. But what's, I think, perhaps striking is that in many ways the kind of society which Young envisaged has, at least to some extent, actually come into being. The ability of the talented to accrue ever higher rewards is driving economic inequality and labour market inequalities especially. But perhaps more than that, where the talented feel that they have earned these rewards legitimately, they are much less sympathetic to the cause of those whose position is not so advantaged. And also, crucially, less sympathetic towards the kind of institutions that are designed to nurture solidarity and social protection. And I think a question that goes beyond that, which I'd really like to finish with this afternoon, is about the compatibility between a highly competitive society where what is valued is the attainment of formal educational qualifications and the acquisition of wealth, and some kind of compelling ethical social democratic position. I think there are reasons to question whether those two things really are compatible. And of course, much of the debate after the 2016 EU referendum has been about the capacity of liberal social democracy to have anything to say to communities who feel trapped outside the so-called winner's circle of wealth and prosperity. And this highlights an issue which I hope we'll come on to talk about, especially in the final session, which is about the central importance of communitarian ties that give individuals a sense of identity, belonging, and esteem beyond their value in the market. This was something which actually was very underdeveloped and appreciated in Crosland's work, but it seems to me to be a central question. So let me just conclude by saying that I think there is a Crosland legacy on equality, but it does not lie in specific policies, and nor does it lie in the claim that we can somehow dust down a programme that Crosland would have advanced in the 50s, 60s, or 70s. But I think what we can take from Crosland is a practical determination to eradicate the inequalities that we face in the world today, combined with a very real understanding and appreciation of the political constraints that all governments of the left would face. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Patrick. And before we open up, I wonder if I can just ask you all, you've sort of picked out where you find bits of Crosland that would be applicable now. But I wonder whether, we were talking about his intellectual legacy, but whether there is a legacy of intellectualism that would have a place now. Can you imagine a Tony Crosland of today, a practicing politician who is a confident, openly intellectual person writing something like The Future of Socialism in today's world, and is there a place for that?
I think it's a mistake of a kind of, remember the good old days, wasn't it all brilliant, to say that ideology or ideas have disappeared from politics. I mean, Jeremy Corbyn is a very uninteresting politician, but actually everything else that's going on, the movement that's created to project onto him things, is a movement of people interested in ideology. The right has been ideological. Thatcherism is an ideological project. The Eurosceptics are a kind of bizarre sect, and actually, in a way, the liberal Eurosceptics managed to create a kind of a new ideological and intellectual project. If you want to look at someone like Daniel Hannan or someone like that, he creates a whole movement and, actually succeeds kind of politically. So I think there's plenty of space for ideas. I think the left has spent a lot of its time, in the academy, actually having conversations in the academy that are not connected to debates about politics in society to which the intellectual contribution can be there. And I think if you've got an effective politics in the academy would connect out to social movements. I think the left is losing on power because it talks about empowerment in a way that makes sense in the seminar and doesn't make sense to any of the people who they want to empower, because they're not the people, you've got people talking about, I want to give power away, rather than people saying, I want to take power, I want to have more power. And so it's, the right has actually made much better offers on power. Do you want to buy your own council house? People say, thanks very much, that looks good for me. Do you want to take back control in the referendum? That felt empowering in a way that all the sort of centre-left projects about the politics of a new economy, people haven't even known what the offer is yet. And so actually, I think there's plenty of space for ideas and ideology, but it's got to be communicated as politics that mobilises people.
Thanks. Britain doesn't have the strong tradition of public intellectuals that, say, France does, where that's almost a sort of a role people take on. Having said that, there are lots of politicians who are fascinated by ideas, who make interesting contributions. I think John Griffiths is here and he's speaking later, for example. And one of the changes that have really occurred in any significant form since Crosland's death is the sort of emergence of think tanks, which do allow politicians of all political hues a way of contributing towards academic debates, putting out think pieces in a way that perhaps wasn't the case when Crosland was writing. There is the issue that Sally raised earlier. Politicians don't have the time now to do what Crosland did. I mind you, he wasn't an MP when he wrote most of The Future of Socialism, but they are under much more time constraint than ever before, and that does make it more difficult to fulfill that role as a public intellectual.
Yeah, I mean, this might seem like something of an odd answer for someone who's just written a book about Crosland, but actually, in a way, that the politician or the political figure from this period that I've become most interested in is actually Michael Young. Now, obviously, I was too far into the writing of the book to change my mind and write a book about Michael Young, although perhaps I'll do that at some point in the future. But I think, what was interesting about Michael Young, and quite different in some ways to Crosland, was twofold. One is that he was an intellectual, but he was deeply embedded in community life, particularly in the East End of London, which is appropriate given this event is co-hosted by the Mile End Institute. But also, in Young's work, his ideas are not just abstract, coming from theoretical discussions within the academy, but obviously they're being seeded and developed within a very practical day-to-day context. I mean, he's doing as well as thinking. And it seems to me that's, what we need more of. It's not really about creating yet more generations of public intellectuals who can opine from the academy, but it is about people who are intellectually engaged, but also able to evolve through experimentation and real engagement in community life, a new set of approaches, which maybe aren't even policies, but they are changing at a deep level practices in a way that can really begin to address and eradicate some of the persistent inequalities and disadvantages that we see in our society. In some ways, perhaps closest to the early model of Sure Start, which the Labour government brought in 97, but changed in ways which I think were harmful. Anyway, I won't go into Sure Start, but that would be my response.
I think as well, public intellectuals don't make brilliant politicians. I mean, the Political Studies Association gave an award to Michael Ignatieff last week for a lifetime contribution. And actually, as a lifetime contribution as a public intellectual, it's brilliant. But as a sort of politician, he just got absolutely beaten up, brutally just eviscerated. You know, Ed Miliband, you know, is a sort of, you know, intellectual, really good man and intellectual in politics trying to cope with the sort of media age. It is a very difficult thing. I mean, maybe you want your public intellectuals, you know, in the room and, you know, let someone who enjoys the sort of media politics of today, you know, do the politics.
Right, let's take some questions. We'll do it in groups again. So if I start at the very back there, and then gentleman here, and then over there. So.
What you think about maybe Crosland's more negative legacy to third party. One of those might be the rise to the rejection of the question of ownership as being important. Because you can understand why Crosland comes to reject ownership as being central. It's very specifically brought out of the time he was writing, not just nationalisation of the changing nature of British capitalism. I think maybe one of the legacies of that being that no one really wants to think about whether ownership really matters for them anymore, particularly within the mainstream of third party.
Thank you.
One of the more interesting developments in left-wing or centre-left thinking in the last few years has been what Ed Miliband called trying to make capitalism more responsible, what Theresa May now seeks to do to help the people who are just managing, emphasising things like reform of corporate governance and that sort of thing. Patrick, in your brilliant book, you point out that Crosland himself foreshadowed some of that work. I think back in the 50s, he was talking about reform of corporate governance and so forth. Isn't that at least one element of thinking that, even if we don't realise it, still influences us today, and indeed, in theory, could provide one basis for the regeneration of centre-left thinking?
I'll stand up. Excellent contributions, but I do want to take issue with one thing Sunder said about Crosland not being relevant to present times. I think he's wholly relevant, because I think the fundamental problem that we have at the moment is the title of his first book, Britain's Economic Problem, because it's the fact that for the
Right, we probably don't have time for you all to answer each of them, but if you can sort of take your picks, we've got the legacy of the question of ownership, responsible capitalism, and Britain's economic problem and pay cuts. So, you want to kick off?
Well, just say very quickly on Stephen's question about responsible capitalism. I mean, Crosland's ideas and views on this question are quite ambiguous because on one level, at least in The Future of Socialism, he conveys quite a lot of satisfaction with the existing system of capitalism, to the point where he argues that capitalism is being civilized in ways that were positive, at least in the context of the 1950s. But it is true that he also developed a more critical approach on some questions. In that time, I think perhaps one of the most important debates was about what was called workers' democracy, which was about how to give people a sense of greater ownership over the organisation that they worked for, trying to create much greater participation, which it seems to me are much more interesting ways of thinking about the problem today. I mean, I think having workers' representatives on company boards would be a positive development, but it is a technical solution. I think the real question is about, can people both exercise more power in their work, but also obviously address some of the issues that Roger was alluding to about pay and pay inequality. And then just on the question about ownership, I think that the question was right, that it's true that partly as a result of Crosland's influence, ownership has been a neglected theme in the Labour Party over the last 50 or 60 years, at least to the extent that there's been a somewhat unhelpful debate between, as it were, a caricatured left that believes in nationalisation and a caricatured right which rejects public ownership. That is a caricature, not least because many of the revisionists actually continue to believe in public ownership. But it seems to me that the idea today that you can have nothing to say about the ownership of assets, given the sort of wealth divide that I was describing, and also given the fact that it's obvious that the structure of the railways, which is a legacy of the 1980s privatisation, or I should say the early 1990s privatisation, is completely dysfunctional. Now, I think the answer is not necessarily to go back to full-throated nationalisation, but to try to think about new models of ownership which might deliver the outcomes of equity and efficiency that we want. And on that point, ideas about social ownership and mutualisation were being discussed a little bit in the 50s and 60s by figures like Crosland and Gateskill. The ideas were not developed. It seems to me to be another example of a set of ideas to which we could return today, which seem to me deeply important in addressing some of these economic questions.
Yeah, let me half disagree with Roger. I think Roger's right about political economy. Flat real incomes matter in politics. Quite an important mistake, in my view, that Social Democrats always make is then to say those things matter and the culture and identity grievances are simply a read across of those things, which leads people to saying we need to talk about immigration. You say, I know what you mean. I'm going to talk to you about jobs, housing and real incomes. I'll have the conversation you want. Actually, there's just strong evidence against that. The salience of immigration rises considerably in the issue index after 2004 with the expansion eastwards. It then doesn't go up between 2008 and 2011. It falls considerably. And if this was just a reading across of economic anxiety, it would rise in the crash. It doesn't, it falls, and it grows in 2012, 2014, 2016, when uneven growth is back. And that's because questions, I think this is sort of Ed Miliband's social democratic sort of mistake. Immigration is essentially a question of resource allocation, and we have social democratic levers to pulls, and if I move the funds to the areas of change, I'll have moved the funds and I'll say fair shares to everyone. That's half of the issue, and it's the less important half, because actually questions of immigration aren't just a question of fair shares and resource allocation. The big question isn't only is there opportunity, is it fair, are you dealing with the pressures? The big question is actually how do people become us? And therefore you need a social democratic communitarian politics, a politics of the common good, not just a politics of fair shares. And I think social democrats keep wanting to have the debate they're comfortable with, the class distribution impacts, and keep ducking away from the debate people are actually asking them to have.
I'm going to try and reflect on the question about ownership as well, and also on something that Patrick said about the nationalisation of the railways. My favourite story about the nationalisation of the railways is when it happened, Reverend Aubrey, who wrote Thomas the Tank Engine, changed the name of one of the characters from the Fat Director to the Fat Controller, but the character stayed exactly the same. And that says something quite profound about power relationships in nationalised industries. Now, the thing we haven't talked very much about today is something that Crosland's often most often known for, is the clear distinction he drew between ends and means. And he drew that largely to criticise the left of the Labour Party, who he argued confused ends and means when talking about nationalisation. Nationalisation should be a route. The end was a more equal society. And that's what social democrats or socialists should care about. And that had a kind of revival, particularly under the New Labour period, with people talking about alternative means of provision for public services. So the argument would be it doesn't matter if the hospital you go to is a Bupa-owned hospital or an independent sector treatment centre of another kind, providing it's free at the point of use. What matters is the end, not the means. But the question is important because obviously it does matter to the producers and the people who work in those hospitals if they are shifting between working for a private provider and working for a public provider. It does most likely lead to a less settled form of employment. So whilst as users of services, as consumers, ends and means make sense as a division, as producers, to say there's a very clear distinction between how services are provided and the end is rather more complicated.
Okay, let's take one last quick round, but otherwise we'll run out of time for panel 3, which will be a disaster. So in the middle over there, and then here.
My name is Hassan. I'm from the research fellow from Turkey. Just wanted to say, just a comment, but it has a question for yourself as well. Since the Industrial Revolution until now, in time and space, this discussion has been taking place. What we've been talking about here, how to take capitalism or regulation, deregulation, nationalization, denationalization. This is across time. In 1920s, people had the same discussion. 60s, 2008, Katwala wrote about it as well. And also in times and space, I may look to you very original, but I have read Crosland, his book and your book, and you can find it in Turkish intellectuals in Africa and Latin America, similar ideas, how to regulate, deregulate, create growth, create jobs, whatever. This discussion has been taking place all the time, and across time and across space, in Africa, in Latin America, in New York, in Turkey, in the Middle East, in Asia. What seems to be, I think, the existential question, the ontological question which you don't address, what creates inequality? After all this discussion we had centuries, still there is an unbelievable inequality in the world. 1% of the population has 60% of the world resources. Inequality is growing within the world, within the nation states as well. In Britain, inequality is unbelievable, unprecedented throughout history. Also, the environment is disaggregated. Working class is disaggregated. Their organizations is not as strong as. Also, we have the populist reaction, the right and the nationalism is also increasing. So all these discussions resulted in what we are today. We have inequality, rise of populism, and environmental destruction. So what is the essence? The question, what generates this? What generates inequality? Thank you.
And the question over here.
Tony Harmos. Education. I'm not sure I found it out checking it out from future socialism and how much he said about education then, because he was education secretary for 4 or 5 years, crucially abolished starting the abolition of ground schools circa 1065 and all that. Would he, what does the panel think he would say about where we got to, in particular, that we seem to have failed in his basic mission? Yes, he abolished the ground schools, very good idea. Yes, 45% go to university, whereas anywhere future social had 5% went to university. But we have a crisis in education where the other 55%, we have the collapse of further education, we have the PISA results only yesterday showing that we're down in the middle of the table. After all these years, after all these policies, what would he say and what does that mean for us now?
Okay, so what is the essence? Where does it all come from? Where does the inequality come from? And education policy today? Simon, do you want to start off?
Well, I'll focus on the education question, if that's all right. The other one's too big for me to deal with here. I'm not sure we are in crisis in education, but I accept the sort of broader point about what Crosland would have said. And I try to allude to some of that in what I talked about. He makes, in terms of his legacy and his contribution, he makes a very powerful case for significant state investment in education. That was done under New Labour. That should continue to be done. I think he didn't look enough at the idea that education is also a positional good, as I tried to say earlier, that private schools will exist and effectively sell status for their pupils, and they will give status to pupils as a direct result of other pupils not being able to go to that school. So he was sort of, he was disapproving of private schools and argued strongly that they should be, they should make a much harder contribution, bigger contribution to society. I think in his argument, there's a stronger argument than that you can really push public and private schools to make a much, much wider contribution. And he was probably naive because of that about the extent to which if government invested enough in education, eventually people wouldn't want to go to private and public schools anymore because the state alternative would be good enough. He didn't take into account the kind of the positional element of sending your children to private schools.
What is the essence was a very big question. I think the way to answer it, I think, is to go to the equality of what question, which is, I think it's about, the means of human flourishing and who has them and who doesn't have them. And I think the other big question that rises is, I think the really important question is, when is inequality unfair? And I think Crosland has quite a good way of cutting through, actually, equality of opportunity and equality of outcome. No unjustified inequalities. Get rid of the ones that you can't justify, and we'll see what's left and we'll keep going, because there's a case for meritocracy as well as against it. Right now, I think we can be quite optimistic about the global picture of less inequality, and that has enormous challenges within Western societies for those who are, quite far up the global picture but are losing out positionally to where they were before, and that's what we don't have either a policy answer to or a political answer. What I think, having made some cases against Crosland, just because it's very pro-conference, I thought somebody should. Let me end with a point in favour. I think obviously what always endures in politics is values, but with Crosland what endures is the revisionism. And I think maybe he would feel that social democracy has got rather conservative with a small c. That social democracy in the West and in Europe has had better days, knows it was on top in the 50s, knows it was in the game in the 70s, and is looking back and isn't looking forward. And I think the political problem is there are lots of elections and referendums when it's change versus more of the same. And the Social Democrats are losing because they stand for the status quo. And I think that would puzzle him, because why don't they stand for change?
Well, just very quickly, a big existential question. I think Sunder's right that if one looks at patterns of inequality, though, it's the case that in the global economy, the inequalities between developed and developing countries are to some extent narrowing. The really big issues, of course, as you alluded to in your question, is the inequalities within the advanced capitalist countries. We don't have time, I think, now to really interrogate that. But all I would say is, as a response very quickly, that I think there's something about the ideology of talent and the capacity of the talented to increase their bargaining power within the labour market, which has had a very damaging effect on levels of inequality in ways that I think certainly New Labour never anticipated or never thought about in the 1990s. And I think that's something that we have to go back to. What's interesting is that when you look at the post-war governments, particularly the Attlee government after 45, one of the things it was most interested in was how to create greater equality between different forms of work, between people who use their brains and people who use their hands, between manual labour and mental labour. And that debate has been completely lost today. But it seems to me to be a concern that we have to go back to. And on the question about education, the answer, I think, very directly to what Tony said is that Crosland would have been deeply concerned about the debate on education as proposed by Theresa May's government. And I think he would have been opposed for two main reasons. The first is about values, because he would have objected to a form of education such as the reintroduction of grammar schools, which would have led to greater social stratification. But crucially, Crosland would have also mobilised the evidence. And what the OECD report said yesterday was that education systems across the world that have selective elements translate educational selection into social selection in ways which is damaging for society, but also leads to worst outcomes across the education system. So I think on the basis of values and on the basis of evidence, Crosland would, of course, completely rejected the reforms which the May government has flirted with in the last few months.
So, Patrick, Simon, Sunder, thank you all very much. Can I ask you...